All right. Thank you all for coming and joining us for our second ever Ask Me Anything here on the server. I am extremely excited for this one as I met this person actually a couple weeks ago when I visited UCI for their conference and had a lot of really great conversations. I got to get some really good insight. So I'm really, really, really excited for this one. So the person we're going to be talking today is JT Tiza AMA, who is the Operations and Championship Lead for Riot Games and the newly formed RSAA. So how are you doing today, JT?
Doing well, Greg. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So again, thank you for taking the time to kind of come on the server here and talk through a couple of questions. I know there's a lot of excitement around the college esports world, especially with the new introduction of the. For those that don't know, the RSAA stands for the Riot Scholastic Association of America. So I know there's a lot of excitement around it. So and especially with CLaw season up, I'm really, really, really excited to get you in here.
It's exciting to be here. It's one of the two real busy seasons for me, so it's fun to take time out to talk to people about it.
Yeah, that's great, and then it definitely helps overall with the community so involved with it. So, all right, so I'd mentioned this before, but for those interested, if there's any questions that you have that are not answered, feel free to just throw them in the general chat here on this server. And then, like I said before, the link to this it'll be essentially in a YouTube format. So I'll be sharing that around for those that are interested. So JT, why don't you start off to give a little introduction about yourself? I gave kind of a brief intro, but maybe what your position at Riot is, and kind of your history within college esports.
Yeah, so my name is JT Vanbury. I also go by Tiza on the internet. As Greg mentioned, my official job title is one of two things. At Riot, my job title is Associate Esports Manager College. And with the RSAA, my job title is Operations and Championships Lead. I've worked for Riot for going on 8 years now, starting off working on the World Championship and the launch of the LCS, and sort of working my way down the pyramid. I launched our Challenger Series, which was our organized minor league, when that launched in 2014. And I ran that program up until 2017, where I switched over to the college team where I am now. My day-to-day is pretty much anything you'd expect to happen in a commissioner's office. So that's everything from ideating on rules and formats for the season itself for the college championship, working with John Gallagher and the fine folks over at Battlefy on the actual season administration itself, and iterating with them on their process and their website. Managing a lot of our relationships with partner conferences and varsity programs, whether that's getting them spun up to participate for the first time or helping them work with their affiliate members to build a format that works for everybody and things like that. Before Riot, I worked at a small web design company fresh out of college, and I ran video game tournaments in my spare time. I am actually, there's a question about this somewhere, but I was actually a competitive Dance Dance Revolution player, and then the Groove player. That's where I got my start organizing tournaments until I got hooked on League of Legends and started playing it an irresponsible amount before getting hired at Riot.
Thank you for that. You heard it here first, folks. Riot's doing competitive DDR in the esports scene. But no, thank you for that introduction. So we're going to kind of jump right into things here. So first question is a very general one, but what would you say is Riot's, and you can even go into your specific role in the college esports realm?
Yeah, so Riot Games' mission with League of Legends is to make League a global sport that lasts for generations. That affects how we approach everything from the World Championship to regional leagues like the LCS or the LEC, all the way down to how individual regions plan out the amateur space. So, like, for example, Europe has national leagues that are centered around countries. NA has things like Scouting Grounds and the College Series. Our goal on the college team is to make League of Legends a generational, inclusive college sport in the US and Canada, which is what we consider North America. That is very broad, and the words are kind of very intentionally chosen. Just like we want League to last and exist kind of persistently in the same way that a football or a basketball or a baseball exists, we want to get League of Legends to that point where it's something that the value is understood. It's ingrained in college and university campuses, just like any other sport is. We don't see the difference between esports and sports in terms of the value they have for a college student becoming a more well-rounded adult. And that's a mission that we're sort of working with colleges to sort of understand the value of gaming and esports broadly, how it can reach their students and enrich sort of their lives at college and the adults they eventually will turn into once they're done.
That's great. I love the concept of the generational, the coverage, essentially comparing it to traditional sports in that sense. So kind of going off of that, we mentioned earlier the newly found Riot Scholastic Association of America. So why don't you go into some details about that? What were the main reasons for the implementation of RSAA, and then what are some maybe short-term and long-term goals for the organization?
Yeah, so the primary goal of the RSAA is to sort of be our channel for talking directly to universities and schools and their administrators. We are very good at talking to players. That's what we do as a company all the time in everything we do. And that kind of naturally extended into the birth of the college season to begin with, was an expansion on what players were self-organizing at their universities. So when we first started doing college, we were like, hey, players really care about this. This is super important to them. Let's get involved and make this bigger and more badass than individual students or schools could on their own. And the RSA is sort of the next evolution of that, where now we have dozens of universities that are starting varsity programs that are curious on ingraining esports into part of their culture. And they want to know the best ways to do that. They want to learn about this ecosystem that they may or may not be familiar with. So the RSA is our way of saying, like, hey, administrators, we are planning on doing this forever. We really lean into that word generational. We want this to be the kind of thing where, I'm thinking about, would I want my kid to be a professional gamer someday? Just like I'm sure many people go through do I want my son or daughter to be a professional athlete or a musician or anything else? So the RSA primarily is to be a point of contact for administrators. And secondly, it's sort of to reestablish what our mission is in a language that makes sense to schools. I'm sure you've all heard many iterations of X organization is going to be the NCAA of esports. And we don't necessarily see a need for that because the governing body of College League of Legends is Riot Games. That's the role that we want to take. We do want to be very proactive on how we organize things, how we oversee the mission of the college league and the best way of executing that. We're in a lucky position in that profit is not a mandate for our college program. So we are not looking to quickly break even in our investment in college, for example, in the way that a private institution might. And when I say institution, I mean business, not school. And so we also have the luxury of taking a very long-term view of where we want this ecosystem to be decades from now. And if you are a university or a college, that's the timeline that your administrators have to think on in general. They're not thinking about what are we doing in the next 5 years, they're thinking what are we doing in the next 20, 30, 40 years out. So the RSA is a way for us to say, hey, this isn't something we're doing as a marketing pitch. We're not saying, hey, kids, come play the new hotness, and once we get them in the door, we leave. We're trying to build an ecosystem that lasts for a long time, and that requires us to align our interests with students, but also our interests with university administrators. And the RSA is a way for us to make that clear, both by describing ourselves in language that makes sense to administrators that may not know esports. Saying the developer runs the league is one thing. Saying the developer created this institution to sort of guide the long-term vision of the space is something that makes more sense to schools.
Yeah, that's great, and I love that. I love the partnership between the developer and the schools themselves. So kind of going off of that, what are ways that you see the schools getting involved with the RSAA and, kind of helping provide guidance? Obviously the developers, being Riot, running the league, but they're running the league for these collegiate programs. So how do you find college programs giving back to the RSAA and helping the whole ecosystem grow?
Yeah, so first of all, we have a board of advisors that we sort of handpicked from the higher education sphere. So that's people that have run esports programs at universities. These are people that are involved in the business of college sports and many times also in esports that can give us perspectives that we don't know. Something that we've always said from the beginning, whenever an administrator comes to us and says, hey, we want to do esports at our institution, what's the best way to do esports? We always reply, we don't know, because they will always understand education and higher education better than we ever will. What we can do is share best practices and get experts in the field in touch with each other. So we very often refer people, for example, to an AJ Dimmick or a Mark Deppy that are people that have built these programs, because they're going to be better at building programs than us. So a lot of our role is just sharing best practices and connecting people that are deeply involved. As far as directly contributing, we want to hear from every program. We have a mailing list that we send information out to that anyone can sign up on the footer of our website. It's just rsaa.riotgames.com. But we want to have conversations with programs wherever they are, regardless of their size or their scope or their intentions, because we will always need more perspective. Universities are incredibly diverse. They all have different goals. They all have different resources. They all have different player bases. So the more that we hear from programs and we hear about the problems that they're having or the ideas that they've come up with or their aspirations from the future, the more we can incorporate that into kind of our plans and our communications moving forward. We see ourselves as leaders in this space, but we choose to be sort of servant leaders. We don't necessarily want to grab people by the nose and say this is the way to do it. We want to find out what our constituents need, whether those are the students themselves or club teams or varsity programs or institutions or conferences, and find the best way to serve them through our organization.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great to hear. And for those that are interested, I did just link the RSAA website in the general chat for those that wanted to go check it out. And you can find, like JT said, you can find the mailing list information there on the site for those that are interested. So let's kind of go a little in depth here into the League of Legends world of the college esports realm. So what would you say have been some of your biggest successes so far working with C-Law, and then what are some things that you would want to maybe see improve going into the future?
Sure. As far as success goes, a big thing is just sort of the size of the program itself. 2 years ago, we had our biggest year ever when 254 schools competed. And then last year, 248 schools, excuse me. And then last year, 356 schools competed, which was awesome. This year, registration is still in progress, but our trend of schools getting into the pipeline is way higher than the last 2 years. Obviously, no concrete numbers yet because registration is still going for another 18 days, but really excited to see the overall growth of the college law season. You can have high-level debates about the best way to approach the philosophy of a college esports program or rules and structure, but at the end of the day, schools will tell you if your program's any good by showing up. So we've been really, really humbled by the amount of involvement that we've had and the amount of feedback and input we get. Whether it's positive or negative, something that we always say is that they're only angry if they care. If they're kind of like, well, this kind of sucks, but whatever, that's like one of the worst things you could ever hear, because it means they don't actually care about sort of the long-term health of your program. They're just kind of like, this is fine. Other things that are super successful that I've been really proud to be a part of is the college championship in general. This year, in case you haven't seen, we've announced that we're expanding the college championship to 32 teams from 8. Last year, the live event portion of the top 8 teams was a really huge success. We had great viewership numbers and a lot of great feedback overall. The goal of the college championship is sort of to be the capstone of the season and the galvanizing moment where we all kind of come together and poke our heads up from underwater and say, hey, North America, this program exists and it's really special and you should check it out. So really excited to kind of double down on the college championship as our marquee event and see how we can continue to grow it and sort of share the boost that schools get for participating in the biggest college esports event in North America to a wider array of schools.
So,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, JT.
I was going to say some things that we definitely want to improve on. We always want to improve our communications channels. Something we say every year is, how do we get more information out sooner to more people? I think we did a little bit better this year than last year in terms of getting information organized and shared early, but there could always be sooner. It could always be more clear. It could always be broader in scope. So some things we're definitely looking on is building out sort of our varsity program Rolodex in a sense. Obviously, a varsity program doesn't need our permission to exist. We would love to talk to them just so we can understand who they are and what they're trying to do. But a lot of times, someone will ask, oh, how many varsity programs are there? And we have a ballpark idea, but it's all third-hand knowledge or second-hand knowledge. So we'd love to build up communication channels and direct contact with as many varsity programs as we can. And also continue to keep open channels with students directly. Something that's super important to us is making sure that there aren't too many steps in between us and the players, because at the end of the day, one of Riot's core missions is to aspire to be the most player-focused game company in the world. So no matter how good our relationships are with a school or the conference or anyone in between, if that comes at the expense of our relationship with the players, we can't have it. So being able to sort of keep a finger on all pulses at once is a very unique challenge, but it's something that we're really excited to take on and continue to improve at.
Yeah, and then kind of going off of that follow-up question, as you mentioned, every single year we've seen expansion within the league. What are steps that Riot and RSAA are taking to ensure that, as this league it will grow and grow and grow, that it'll still have the success that it's already had and, continue to have additional successes?
Something that's really important to us is scale. We are a really small team. The entire Scholastic team at Riot is 4 people. And that covers all of our college efforts. It includes the college season and all of our club activations. It includes our efforts in high school. And it will probably eventually take on other games as Riot continues to move forward on the games that we announced recently during our 10-year anniversary celebration. So a lot of it is sort of future-proofing process, finding ways to sort of become force multipliers to a process that can handle lots of things rather than being very tactical and hands-on with minor details. So a big example of that is our relationship with Battlefy. I cannot recommend Battlefy highly enough for anyone that is working on kind of community events or anything of the sort. They've been great to work with. But our relationship with Battlefy has let us scale up our administrative ability 100-fold with no real extra effort from us. And finding ways to kind of build those sorts of third-party relationships that let people that are experts in a very specific set of skills do those at a very high level and sort of offload that from the core team themselves. So for example, 3 years ago, we had the first year of our partnership with the Big Ten Network. I ran that entire league myself. So I was sort of the head admin, I was doing the brackets, I was updating match results, etc. Obviously, we have 10 plus partner conferences this year. If I was running every single partner conference myself, that would be my full-time job and I wouldn't get anything else done. So our relationship with Battlefy lets us scale to hundreds of schools and maybe beyond that someday. And we want to continue expanding the number of conferences we work with. And so we work with Battlefy to build up sort of future-proof processes that can handle any number of schools that we throw at them. One of our old country managers used to joke, we'd say, hey, we have over 300 schools registered. And he'd say, cool, how many colleges are in the US and Canada? And we're like, 20,000-ish. He's like, cool, how do we get to 20,000? And that's, I don't know if that's literally possible, but that's the kind of thing where we want to look towards being future-proofed as much as possible in our processes. That also sort of leads us to be as communicative as possible. I sort of mentioned sharing information broadly. We need to get good at communicating and building sort of evergreen locations for where information about Riot's college efforts lives, and that's one of the other objectives of the RSAA is that we can put thought leadership pieces on the RSAA website and they'll always be there. We can put the season rules on the RSAA website and they'll always be there. Then someone can say, oh, how do I learn about College League of Legends? Someone just says, go to the RSAA website and everything's there. They already know how to get a hold of us. They know when the season starts. They know the structure of the league. They know other schools they could talk to learn more. and sort of building an ecosystem that can self-sustain without Riot having to do all of the things all the time, or without having a manual touch on everything if we can help it.
So you mentioned that obviously now that there's 10 plus partner conferences, which is obviously growing substantially. What would you say are the biggest benefits that partnering with these conferences can bring? And then what would you say to those conferences that you're trying to get on board? What would be the biggest benefits, mutually between the two groups?
Sure. So the biggest benefit for us in partnering with a conference is that we get 10 school administrators listening to us instead of one from one conversation. When we were first sort of leaning into the varsity model, we would talk to individual universities and talk to them about them potentially getting a program set up when they were interested, and walking them through that process. And we realized that was a lot of time and a lot of work for one program. It's sort of talking about scaling and being more efficient with the work. That also introduced kind of broader concerns about, if we're supporting an individual varsity program and helping them get off the ground, and then they're participating in the league that we run, that sort of creates a weird optical situation that we might be favoring teams, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So working with a conference, so for example, when we first started that relationship with the Big Ten Network, they were like, cool, we have 10 out of the 12 member institutions of the Big Ten immediately on board to support their school teams at an administrative level. And that kind of turnaround is really, really great for us. It allows us to spread the impact of administrative support across a broader network of schools very quickly. And something that we have learned is that at the end of the day, like, we have to reach some of the highest people at universities to get them to really buy in to a thing like esports, when oftentimes that's very different from what they already do. So a conference is a great way to sort of get in the door, rather than, for example, having a club president, a junior or a senior say, hey, we're pitching our school on why they should support esports. It's kind of a harder sell than, hey, a representative from the conference is saying that we should try this out. Let's give it a shot. The second advantage is honestly just connecting with existing athletics infrastructure. A great analogy we heard from a school administrator once is that college varsity sports is like the front porch of the university's house. It's what gets people's attention and kind of welcomes them in and gives them a view of like, oh, this is cool, I want to check this out. But then that's just what gets them inside the door to the university. And the university has their academic programs, and they have student life, and they have much more to offer than just the sports side of it, but it's what gets people in the door. For us, that is also what college esports is. We think gaming has a lot of value in the academic space for student health enrichment, but also for research opportunities, for career expansion for students in the future. But esports is a way to sort of get in the door of universities to the value of gaming. So for us, if we can speak in a language that universities understand, if we say, hey, this is college esports, this is college League of Legends, we run a regular season in conferences, and then we have a championship, which is a 32 team bracket. That's a language that a university administrator understands. And we can put on a great show with the college championship, and an administrator who may not really understand the concept of gaming or the value that it can provide can look at the college championship, can look at what we're doing in esports and say, oh, this is just like athletics. I understand why athletics are important to a university. Tell me more about this esports thing. And then we go from esports to, this is why we think gaming is important and why gaming is good for your students. And going from there. So that informs a lot of the structure of the college season, and it's also why conferences are very useful, just because we translate sort of gaming into a language that's more easily understandable.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love to hear the well-rounded approach, not just about the games themselves, but about the careers and the opportunities that, these types of programs and opportunities presents for the students. So kind of getting into the nitty-gritty here of this upcoming CLAW season. So as you mentioned before, moving from an 8-team to a 32-team championship is one of the changes that is coming with the season, but also another one of the big changes is the change to the scholarship prize pool for CLAW. So what were the goals behind the that change and just changes in general, and then what are the plans in the future to maybe adapt or learn from how the successes of it as it goes forward?
So something that we've always been sort of aware of with the scholarship structure that we had previously was that there's a financial disincentive for schools to join a partner conference. Because partner conferences are sort of on their own to provide scholarships, decide to provide scholarships or not. And every single time they've had the option, they've decided not to. So if you are a top 8 school in a regional conference and your school goes, hey, good news, we're joining this partner conference, that's actually bad news to that team because now they don't have a chance of getting scholarships anymore. And that sucks, to be totally blunt. And even if schools weren't already in that position, so if you weren't already a school that was in position to earn scholarships, we expect schools that start backing up their programs with varsity support or administrative support in general are going to get better and are going to get more competitive and stronger and make it more likely for them to be in the running for what would have been scholarships in the future, which they still wouldn't have access to. So we knew we wanted to move scholarships back to the college championship to give access to the potential scholarships to every school, regardless of what conference they're in. And that was sort of one of the big motivating factors for that. A second one is that as much as we want to say that the college championship is about the honor and the glory and representing your school, the fact of the matter is that's not as universal as we always hope. So we did have a case a couple of years ago where there was a team that won their conference, went to the college championship, like didn't really care. And they weren't really motivated. They were kind of lackadaisical about everything. And even though it was the college championship, they were like, yeah, I don't really care. We got our scholarships already, so we're just checking out. And that is absolutely fatal to any kind of championship or competitive effort. You just can't have that. So putting the more extrinsic incentive back into the college championship was also important to us. As far as the scholarship amounts go, we're always sensitive to the perception of winning prizes through college competition, especially as we're trying to align with traditional college athletics models that naturally will overlap into discussions about the NCAA or amateurism or, what's really the point of participating? Is this just a way for students to make money and so on and so forth? And there were cases where partner conferences straight up told us, hey, if they're making 10K, 20K, 30K in scholarships off of participating, I don't know if we can be a part of this program just because that's going to get us in trouble with the conference or get us in trouble with the NCAA. So we sort of were somewhat capped on how high we could make those championship scholarships go. We also made a decision several years ago that we didn't want the college season to be about big flashy prize pool numbers. There was a time, 4 or 5 years ago, as around when Blizzard was getting involved in starting Heroes of the Dorm, where they announced a bigger prize pool, or bigger scholarship prize pool than ours. And this is before my time, but I've heard the story plenty of, everyone got in a room and is like, so what do we do? Do we one-up them? Do we let it go? Do we stop doing scholarships? And the decision was made that hey, this isn't about big, sexy prize pool numbers. And if we start this arms race, it may never end. So we didn't want it to be about the size of the money, just like college athletics are not about, sending big checks to students to take home with them. It's about giving them an opportunity to get an education. So we kind of hard limited the cap, and then we scaled down from there to make, what we thought was a compelling prize pool scale from there. And that was one of the hardest things that we've done since I've joined the college team. Because we know that, it's really hard to have that conversation in a way that doesn't sound like Riot doesn't want to spend the money anymore, or Riot's concerned about how financially viable the college season was. So the big challenge for us is how do we explain this in a way that makes sense and gets students who all imagine the scholarship prize money to be theirs before the season starts to just trust what we're going for and realizing that it's not about the scholarship money, it's about the larger program and what it means. And I think one of the biggest proof points of that was, talking about the amount of scholarship money that's in the ecosystem that's not being paid by Riot. A year ago, that was just under $1 million, or 2 years ago, that was just under $1 million. Last year, it was $3 to $4 million. This year, it's going to be much higher than that. And we think the best place for scholarships to come from is from schools, because schools are the ones making decisions about the kinds of students that they want at their university, the kind of culture that they want to build and what's important to them. So leaving that decision to schools rather than that coming down from us is where we think the most healthy outcome is at the end of the day. So building a world where, one, schools are comfortable existing in our ecosystem and don't feel pushed out by large prize pools, and also just acknowledging that, like, hey, we're not the best qualified people to decide what students should earn scholarships and what shouldn't, and leaving that decision with the experts as much as possible.
So one big point that you mentioned, and kind of comparing to the idea of scholarships within the field as we know it now, was the idea of aligning with traditional college sports models. So how do you find that these recent changes help to additionally align those with the college sports models? And do you find any pushback, or do you find it to be misaligning ideals in any kind of ways?
Specifically to scholarships, or do you mean the overall changes for this year?
Both, if you're able to.
Sure. Um, so scholarships, frankly, is like a topic that we discuss with a lot of conferences and programs all the time. Especially the more that we've gotten, like D1 football conferences to get involved, that always comes up very quickly about, like, oh, we're not sure if we can do this, or we're not sure how this will work out with the NCAA, and so on and so forth. So some of that is absolutely building a structure that is palatable to schools that are aligned with the NCAA. Obviously, if we do something and say, no, this is super important to us, and a bunch of conferences are like, we can't swing this, we've shot ourselves in the foot, because our goal is to expand the reach of College League of Legends. And so our changes have to serve that goal in the end. As far as sort of other changes go, like, there's nobody in college athletics that doesn't understand the big bracket. I mean, March Madness is iconic. It's one of the, I think, most fascinating and phenomenal sporting events in the world. And there's a reason for that. The format's super compelling. It's easy to understand. It gets a lot of schools involved in something really special. And we took a lot of inspiration from that. We knew one of our big points of feedback from last year was that the college championship play-in format was really obtuse. It existed to sort of merge a weird, odd number of conferences into a nice, even 8 teams. And it was kind of like the remainder after long division. we did a lot of like complicated work, and at the end of the day, we had a wonky number that we just had to slap on the end somewhere. And even the people that really cared about College League of Legends as fans, as competitors, were like, man, I can't keep up with this. I don't really understand. And the format was necessitating a lot of games in a short period of time. And our first value pillar in the college program is students first. It's that these students that are participating in our program are at a university to get an education. Their participation in our program is an accessory to them getting an education. So we never want to ask for too much time from students or too much of a commitment past a certain point that might take away from their academics. So for those 2 reasons, we were like, okay, we need to blow this up, but how? And then, we just looked at college athletics and we're like, I mean, everyone understands playoffs, everyone understands a bracket. There's a lot of inherent value in that. So that was an example of something where we learned from traditional college athletics, and we think we've made our program a lot better because of it.
That's great. That's great. And then kind of going into, the future, like as you mentioned earlier, it's not about the next 2 to 3 years. It's about the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. Obviously, with Riot announcing their new and upcoming titles, what are the plans in the future for the RSAA to maybe take these titles under their wing, or to go into more future collegiate esports titles?
Yeah, so there's 2 sides of that. The first is that the college program is nestled under our sort of regional publishing teams. So in our case, North America has their own region, and it's our job kind of as a department to publish League of Legends and our games in North America. That means we are sort of, what's the right word? Basically, we take cues from the game teams themselves in terms of the direction of the game, and then go from there to find the best way to amplify that message and take that game in the direction that the game team wants to. So in the case of new games, we don't know what kind of esport Legends of Runeterra is going to be yet. They're still trying to figure that out, and that's everything from what is the format of a standard tournament to do we want this to be hyper competitive world championship, regional or national teams, or do we want this to be sort of a more egalitarian, big open bracket, smaller matches and so on. Like the game team hasn't answered those questions yet, and that's true for all games. And at the end of the day, we want to amplify the strategy of the game team itself. So what that means is I can't tell you today whether or not there's going to be a Legend of Runeterra College Championship or a Project A College Championship. We don't know that quite yet, but we're kind of waiting for that to kind of materialize internally and then go from there. The second point is that I mentioned this earlier, but College League of Legends exists because college students were really excited to compete and represent their schools. And they started to build structure around that, and we responded to that need by becoming a force multiplier and making something bigger and more spectacular than the students could on their own. And that's going to be the same motivation that we have for getting involved in future games in some capacity. If our players really, really, really want it, like we'll meet them where they are and give them something. That may not necessarily be a college championship or the same model that we have now. It might be more club focused. It might be more competitive and more organized than the College League of Legends season is. We don't know that yet, but something that we do know is that at the end of the day, as I've said several times, and you'll probably hear me say it several more times, we're looking to serve our players first and foremost. So if they tell us that's what they really want, we're going to meet them there and do something for them.
So kind of going off of that, what would you say would be the best way for students at these universities for these upcoming games, or just in general, to provide, their interest, to provide their interest level for these future competitive leagues?
Mostly play the games. I mean, we have our whole business team around tracking gameplay and how things are going on. So we're going to know where people are playing our game and how often they feel about it. And then at the end of the day, like, people just need to come talk to us. Just by nature of how events are publicized, we get wind of things here and there, and we have our collegiate@riotgames.com inbox, and people ask us all the time, "Hey, we're running this kind of event. Can you help us in some way? Can you give us some swag? Can you give us advice? Can you sponsor our event?" So on and so forth. So just by keeping constant communication up with our players, giving them the access to come talk to us and ask us questions and tell us what they're working on, we're going to hear more about that, and we're going to move from there.
Great, thank you. And then I mentioned this earlier, but for those that are interested, if anyone has any additional questions that aren't being addressed, feel free to throw them in just the general chat here on the server, and we'll get to them, as we're going through the process. And we are about to get into some questions that were submitted by users, but before we get into that, one last question here, and this is a very general one, JT, so feel free to answer this how you may. But what would you say is some pieces of advice you would provide to new college programs or to student-run programs that are looking to take that next step to the varsity level?
I think I'll caveat this by saying that, we're sort of secondhand experts in terms of building programs. We hear from a lot of programs that have done well and some programs that are trying to get going. But at the end of the day, the students will know what's best at their university. Administrators will know what they're trying to do for the long term. So there's only so much advice that we can give you in this regard. That said, the one thing that I think is super important is always plan for the long term. A repeated problem I hear from students and administrators alike was, our club was really great, and then our club president graduated, and there wasn't anyone to take up the mantle from there, and the club fell apart. And that's true for teams as well. So it's really important to think beyond just the short term, the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year plan, and think about, how is information going to get passed on from student generation to student generation, from faculty advisor to administrator, and so on. How do you do things like, crystallize knowledge, write things down, write run books for how to hold a tryout, or how to get approval to post your flyers on campus. Doing things to make sure that you're putting the ladder down behind you after you climb up, to make sure that the next person up won't have to just reinvent the wheel, relearn how to do all the things you already know how to do. But instead make sure that they can start on even footing with you or close to even footing with you, and then continue to grow upwards from there. One of the best examples I've seen of that, there are a couple of schools that sort of have deputy student leaders. They'll have a club president that's a senior, and they'll have sort of a deputy president or president in training that's a sophomore or a junior, or a younger student in general that's ready to take over when they know that the president's going to leave next year. Because the reality of college is that most students are around for 4 years, some a little bit more, some a little bit less, but every 4 years, you're probably going to end up with 100% fresh faces. So you have to focus on that long-term planning of what are you going to do when all these people around you leave.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that answer. All right, so we're going to start to get into some of the user-based submitted questions here. And again, if anyone has any additional questions, just to reiterate, feel free to ask them here in the general chat. So our first one comes from Ayan, who's actually from York University. And her question is, what was the most difficult decision you've had to make as an administrator? And then what is one piece of advice you would give to someone in a similar place and something you would have known, wish you would have known earlier on?
So I'll give two answers. One is just kind of in general in esports, and the other one will be in college. Honestly, for college, I think one of the hardest decisions I've had to make was figuring out what to do about scholarships this year. That was, I've already kind of touched on it, but that was really tough, both because it's just a complicated problem space, and there is no right answer, and there is no example to look at. No one's had to do this before, so we got to figure it all out on our own. But also because we talk to the students all the time. There are a lot of returning coaches and managers year over year in the college program, and in my 3 years, I've gotten to know a lot of them really well. So I know that cutting down on total scholarships is going to hurt. And there's no way around that. There's no, we can message it artfully, we can tell the bigger story. At the end of the day, we know that it's going to make players unhappy in the short term in sacrifice for the long-term health of the program. And it's really hard to make that call because I'm on Discord pretty much all day, and most of my day is spent seeing the little unread message light pop up in the colleges in Discord, and I hop over to see what's going on. Whether that's, people shit posting and goofing off, or asking questions, or just, spouting off about whatever's going on that day. So we have a lot of great relationships with students. So anything, even if we understand it's worthwhile in the long run, that short-term pain still feels bad, and it's something that we feel a lot. And honestly, I was continually impressed by sort of the maturity and the perspective of all the student leaders that we talked to. There's definitely that kind of frustration of, why is Riot cutting scholarships? Why is Riot expanding what subs get and taking away what other schools get, and so on. But overall, it's been really rewarding to work with such an incredible group of students and administrators. And it sort of made it easier when we were able to say, hey, look, we know this is tough right now, but here's why. And not only did they, understand and ask a lot of smart questions, but they trust us. And that's something that we don't take for granted, and makes our jobs, much easier, knowing that we can rely on students to really understand and care about the long-term future of the program beyond that. And that's really special. The hardest decision I've ever had to make outside of college overall is probably 2014 Worlds Svenskeren. Some of you may immediately recognize this, but basically in 2014, the World Championship was held in Taiwan, Singapore, and Korea. And every World, we sort of give players a degree of cultural sensitivity training. A lot of these players are young. A lot of them haven't traveled outside of the country before. So we try to give them sort of an understanding of, hey, this is how you be a good visitor in a foreign country. This is how you be respectful. This is, these are some pro tips and best practices. Here are some things you shouldn't do. We had a player who changed his summoner name to some racially insensitive stuff. Nothing horrendous, but clearly not good. And sort of memed about it to a player they had met in solo queue that had added them as a friend. It was like, oh, you're so-and-so player. Good luck at Worlds. I hope you do great, so-and-so. And this is before matches even started. So, the guy was on the ground for 4 days, and then immediately does this after receiving training on how to not be racially insensitive in a foreign country. And that was hard because of just the stakes of the situation. What happened was clearly not okay. and we had given him explicit training on what not to do and why that wasn't okay. He did it anyway. So it was clearly he was in the wrong. It wasn't a lapse of communication of, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do this, but also it's Worlds. There is no more important time in League of Legends esports than the World Championship. And we were looking at a decision on suspending a player during Worlds. So just like the stakes of that discussion were so intense, and we met up at like a hotel restaurant at like 11:45 p.m. because that was when everything happened, and we were like, oh no, we have to figure out what to do about this. And yeah, that was some of the most intense discussions that I've ever had doing the operations, because again, that wasn't a situation that had happened before. We didn't really have a one-to-one set of rules that says if you do this, then that, because these things are so situational. So we had to sort of go down this incredible decision tree of, what was the intention behind the wars, what is the impact, what's the audience, and like what's a fair punishment. And we eventually landed on suspending the player for the first 3 games of Worlds, which basically almost guaranteed his team was out of contention, which, is rough, but is kind of the way it works. But at the end of the day, we felt good about where we landed. The community kind of responded well because, everyone recognized the nature of the conduct, and went from there. But that was definitely the most hair I've ever pulled out of my own head during a meeting.
Yeah, I can understand why. I remember that situation very clearly, so I can understand why that would be very stressful to you. So going on here to our next question, and this actually comes from Bernardo Gallegos, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Bernardo, who's actually the University of New Mexico Esports advisor over there. So this is kind of obviously down the line, but with Riot developing a tactical shooter, what is the plan to get the state level K through 12 and collegiate groups on board with first and third person shooters, and just in general, what is the plan to get these schools on board with future esports titles in general?
So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but that's going to come later once the individual project teams design their larger esports strategy and kind of define that as a game. We don't make those decisions in a vacuum. We wait and defer to what the games want to do and the messages they're trying to send and the type of ecosystem they're trying to cultivate. And we try to be, force multipliers of that message and work within that space. Right now, those strategies are being worked on, but aren't set yet. So it would be premature for us to start making decisions or announcements about what we're going to do in this classic space. Obviously, if I had to hypothesize, I don't have to hypothesize on this, shooters in schools is a tough topic. There isn't really a strong path forward, because there are some schools that are immediately like, we're not going to have games with guns in them in our programs, and that's understandable. So that's something that it's something I like to say is we'll jump off that bridge when we get to it, because it's one thing to think about. It's another thing to start having conversations with schools and start getting on a path somewhere, and then find out that the game team itself doesn't want the game to go there. It could be that they go for a super gritty, realistic, or that's not what the game is, but they could go down a path where it just doesn't make sense in schools at all, whether that's because of the esports strategy they're taking or the game content itself, and we're going to defer to that. But so we'll worry about that later.
Great. And then this second question is also from Bernardo, and that is, have there been any steps to create a global governing esports body that could advance gamers' Olympic dreams?
As far as global, no, there hasn't. The reason for that is that every region is very, very different in terms of a governing esports body. So we sort of, Riot is sort of our own global governing esports body for League of Legends. That's sort of the same argument that we make about the RSAA, is that hey, we already are the governing body of College League of Legends. The RSAA just sort of makes that clearer. Riot as a company has participated in a few of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee's investigations into esports. Our CEO, Nicolas Laurent, has gone out there and given presentations about esports and about League of Legends to sort of help that message get out there. But as far as, specifically Olympic involvement, it's something that we think would be very cool, but it's not something that's an explicit priority for us. Something that we sort of learned is that, there's a lot of great times to involve ourselves in the existing channels. College athletics is one of them. But in a lot of cases, like, a lot of players are interested in the Olympics for the prestige of the Olympics rather than the value of esports in the Olympics itself. Not to say that that's wrong or we don't want to be involved in the Olympics. It would be freaking awesome if there were esports in the Olympics. But we care more about being where our players are and doing things that inspire them directly. And right now we're focusing on that first and foremost.
Great, thank you for that. And then I'm actually going to take this question here from Michael in chat because I think this is relevant to kind of what we've been talking about. What would you say is the position of the RSAA regarding the various nonprofit state scholastic esports associations sponsoring competitions in League of Legends, such as the IHSA SEA in Illinois and the WHSEA in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, first off, we're thrilled that there are so many states that are excited to get involved and start rolling up their sleeves and doing work in the space, regardless of whether or not it's League of Legends or something else, or if it's state run or high school or college or anything else. People wanting to be involved and being excited about esports is great, and we support that. Right now, our model sort of in the high school space is that we're funneling people towards our chosen partners in Play Versus and NASEF, and going from there, mostly because for two reasons. One is the scalability that I talked about earlier. There sure are a lot of colleges. There are way more high schools in the US and Canada. And we knew right off the bat that if we tried to do the sort of very hands-on approach and doing everything ourselves in high school like we do in college, there's going to need to be 12 of me. And Ryan doesn't want to hire 12 of me when they already have one. So we want to work smart with partners that can index really heavily on the specific skills that they need and dive really deep into making great high school esports happen, and going from there. There have been several of these that have worked with some of our partners before. And right now we're sort of encouraging them to all get into the funnel. Something that we struggled with for a little while in college was sort of making it clear that our competition is the competition. The College League of Legends series is the premier college League of Legends competition, and everything else can be there and can be accessories, but it becomes damaging to the program when people aren't sure what's more important and where the varsity teams go and so on and so forth. So we want to try to consolidate from there. We see a lot of opportunities for our partners, whether that's Play Versus or NASEF, to get a lot of value out of partnering with high school organizations that are already building up. But honestly, it's very early to tell how that's going to manifest year over year. So right now, we're mostly focusing on getting the people that are enthusiastic and getting work done and getting them all in a room together and saying, hey, what's the best way we can all work together to continue to grow high school League of Legends and high school esports? And that probably won't be one size fits all, which is why we have lots of individual conversations with lots of different state associations. And we're going to continue to iterate very quickly, adapt to what players and schools need, and continue trying to get everybody involved that wants to be involved.
Okay, great. And then we're starting to kind of wrap it up here, everybody. Wanted to try to keep it around an hour. Don't want to take up too much of JT's time, but again, thank you all very much for tuning in. So last couple of questions here. These next ones come from Samantha Close, who's actually the assistant professor of communication at DePaul University. Her first one is, what do you do to support the fans of college teams, and how would you suggest schools do this more?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that a fan wants is they want information. They want to be able to keep up and know what's going on. That's a big part of our partnership with Battlefy. It involves Battlefy publishing everything online. So that is when games happen, who's playing, and then match history, what the stat line was, what the results are, so people can follow along with their favorite team or their alma mater, or their friends or family or whoever they want to keep up with. We also launched a sort of streamer networking program last year that's going to continue to exist this year, which basically takes interested amateur streamers that want to get involved with the college season but aren't necessarily affiliated with an individual school, and connect them with colleges and college teams that want to get their games on stream, so that they can sort of help each other out naturally. At the end of the day, this is one of those things that, like, Riot does stream production very well at a very sort of involved level. We want to make worlds, and we're very good at being like very in-depth, very polished. We can't do that for 350 schools. There's no way. So what we want to do is empower schools to reach out to their own audiences and give them resources to build what works for them. My sort of case study on this was 3 years ago. We paid a lot of money to work with a third-party partner to broadcast 2 college matches every week, sort of a match of the week and a highlighted match from the BTN League. And we wanted to make it, feel really prestigious, really professional. We put a lot of work behind it. We made a really, really great product, and not a lot of people watched. And the reason for that is that there aren't a lot of college super fans right now for College League of Legends. For college football, I have a lot of people that are just fans of college football, and they'll just put the game on Saturday and watch whoever's playing. But really, most of the fans care about their team, their school, their friends. So the more we can do to help schools get their game out there for their friends and their family and their student body, the better the overall impact will be. So like my advice for schools is just embrace the fact that it's really easy to stream games now. It's really easy to make content. You don't necessarily have to think, oh, we need to hire all these people and we need to make this, television quality broadcast. Like, you really don't. I bet you there are a dozen students at your school, whatever your school is, that have a stream, that have streamed before, that can set this up for you pretty easily, and get stuff out there. And going from there and starting from within is like the best way to start building out your program, really easily, really flexibly, really low cost, in a way that really speaks to your students.
All right, and Samantha's second question was, how do you approach making competitive play open to all? And she gave some examples such as accessible controllers, female players, etc. And do you support separate tournaments/leagues accordingly?
This is something we care a lot about and are still learning how to do well. I mentioned sort of the NA college mission is to make League of Legends a generational inclusive sport in colleges in the US and Canada. That word inclusive is there very intentionally. It is super important to us. But at the end of the day, that is something that we're still learning. Arguably, computer games are very accessible because you can come up with a lot of custom controllers. You can do things to make input flexible for your needs. But also, League of Legends is a very mechanically demanding game and complicated game. We have teams at Riot that focus on sort of the accessibility on League of Legends, whether that's things like colorblind mode or making sure champions are designed with both visual and audio cues for their abilities. So the accessibility part is not something that we focus on. What we do focus on is the inclusion part, whether that is gender or ethnicity or sexuality. For the first time ever this year, we've added demographic questions as optional parts of the registration flow for every player, because we need to get a sense of who our players are, wherever they are, so they can stand up and be counted, and we can make sure that we're taking care of them. We're still in a stage of gathering information. We've been working with, AnyKey, if you're familiar with them. They do a lot of great work in diversity and inclusion in esports, about sort of auditing our program and adding value in ways to be more inclusive. So that also includes, I talked about the demographic questions, but also the code of conduct that we're adding, because we want to make sure that the focus in the College League of Legends season is playing League of Legends and representing your school, and to a lesser extent, becoming part of a larger community of people competing in college for League. And we need to be mindful and active about making sure that our space is inclusive to all of our players, wherever they are. As far as, I know the second part of the question was, do you support separate tournaments or leagues? That's not something that we have a formulated point of view on yet, but it is something that we've thought about. Our first step is honestly getting that demographic data in the college season and in other places, and finding out sort of who our players are and how that compares to our player base in the broader League of Legends games or the broader ranked queues, and finding out where we're losing people. or where we're gaining people and why that is. And once we figure that out, we're gonna get a better understanding of who we need to support, who needs kind of more ramps in or ways to get involved that aren't being covered right now, and move from there. And that might be a female presenting tournament for people that identify as female. Or it could be something else altogether, but we don't want to come up with an execution before we've identified what the problem space really is. So this year we're focusing on making our stance clear, whether that's with the new code of conduct or demographic questions and so on, and saying, hey, this is what we're aspiring towards. And then as we continue to gather more information and we get more feedback from the players in our ecosystem and schools, we're going to try to come up with more ways to continue to make this as inclusive as possible.
Great. Well, thank you again, JT, for your time. We have one final question here, which is a question I know will be close to your heart. And this comes from Jason Smethers, who's from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And he asked, why isn't Riot hosting DDR tournaments for collegiate? And then he followed up by saying, but seriously, where do we get DDR collegiate tournaments?
And I've been saying that for years, and no one listens to me here. So a little self-plug is that I actually do support a few DDR tournaments that are running. So if you want more information about that and you actually care, let me know, and I'm happy to direct you to resources and more information. If the question is seriously, where do we get DDR college tournaments? Those are all self-run. All that takes is a machine nearby or a couple of students with a setup, and you can just run it on your own. To be totally blunt, the DDR competitive community is not large. There are maybe at most 1,000 unique players, or maybe 1,500 unique players that enter tournaments in the US for DDR. It'll always be near to my heart, but the way to run it is to do it yourself, build a community locally, and build a tournament for them and activities for them to come out. It's the same as League of Legends. Find your students who are involved. They're on your campus. You just need to go talk to them and go get them. And then just start putting events together. But if you want to argue and wax poetic about Dance Dance Revolution tournament theory, feel free to shoot me a DM, because I'm always down to spend hours talking about it.
All right, well, thank you again, JT, for your time today. I know I can speak for everyone here when I can say we really appreciate it, especially being able to hear directly from the source, just all of the plans and everything for the Riot and RSAA. So thank you very, very much. Is there any final comments you wanted to add here?
Yeah, just want to thank everybody here for coming out. Obviously, I know you're all in here because you care a lot about college esports and your respective institutions. And I just want to say that we would not be in this position without student leaders, without faculty members and university administrators that are passionate about this space and passionate about truly enriching their students' lives and meeting students where they are. So thank you to all of you that help make this possible and teach us so much about this space and help us serve you as best we can.
Great. And yeah, again, to echo that, thank you all for tuning in again. For those that are interested, I put JT's Twitter here on the server. And again, if you scroll up a little bit, you can see the link directly to the RSAA website. So again, thank you all very, very much for tuning in. I'll be putting the YouTube link to this on the server once it's been finished processing, so feel free to share that wherever you would like. And if you have any additional questions, I'm sure JT would not mind answering them if he has the time, obviously. So, all right, thank you all again for tuning in, and you enjoy the rest of your days.